Most of us would agree that the vast amounts of ongoing discoveries, archaeological finds, and research that support the Ancient Astronaut Hypothesis originate predominantly from the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and Europe. But what about the Western Hemisphere, the Americas? Interestingly, in the last several years, archaeologists and other academics have been steadily rewriting the history of the human presence in the Western Hemisphere. In a new book published in 2022, an anthropological geneticist posits a 36,000-year history of how and why peoples migrated into North and South America and made the continents their home. Jennifer Raff, professor of anthropology at the University of Kansas, explains how scientists once thought the peopling of the Americas occurred around 13,000 years ago, following the last ice age, when a small group of people crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Northeast Asia to northwestern Alaska. In the last 10 to 20 years, however, a mountain of new evidence has emerged in the academic world showing that people had been in the Americas for thousands of years before then. According to Raff, around 36,000 years ago, a small group of people living in East Asia began to break off from the larger ancestral populations in the region. By about 25,000 years ago, the smaller group in East Asia itself split into two. One gave rise to a group referred to by geneticists as the ancient Paleo-Siberians, who stayed in Northeast Asia. The other became ancestral to indigenous peoples in the Americas. Approximately 24,000 years ago, both groups independently began interacting with an entirely different group of people, the ancient Northern Siberians. Some archaeologists and geneticists argue that this meeting of the two grandparent populations of Native Americans, the group in East Asia and the ancient community in northern Siberia, occurred because people moved north, not south, in response to the last glacial maximum. Thus, many geneticists look north to Beringia for the location that may have allowed the ancestors of Native Americans to survive the Ice Age. Apparently, these so-called Beringians split into several groups: the ancestral Native Americans, who would move south below the ice sheets and become ancestors of the first peoples, the ancient Beringians, who would stay behind in Beringia, and a mystery group known to us only indirectly from the traces of ancestry it contributed to some Mesoamerican populations. About 17,000 years ago, on the western coast of present-day Alaska, the ice sheets began to melt, and the first peoples expanded southward. This expansion left very clear imprints in the genomes of their descendants. Mitochondrial DNA lineages show us that after the LGM, people were suddenly and rapidly spreading out. Their populations were growing enormously, about 60-fold between about 16,000 and 13,000 years ago. Even though Raff's consolidation of things already known in her academic world progressed the timeline of modern humans in the Americas back beyond 15,000 BC, the entire theory is still premised on the Beringian model. To her credit, Raff admits that the genetic findings only raise more questions. What caused this movement? And how did traces of a new population in North America come to some Mesoamerican genomes about 8,700 years ago? What is the explanation for very ancient traces of shared ancestry between people in South America and those in Australia and Malaysia? Finally, how does the new White Sands Locality 2 site in present-day New Mexico, which may date to the LGM, change our understanding of the genetic models? Well, the White Sands site in southern New Mexico is the focus of a landmark study published in September 2021. In it, researchers suggest that human footprints from an ancient lakeshore in the park date to between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. The archaeologists at White Sands identified tracks that led into layers of rock-hard sediment. The rock contained seeds of spiral ditch grass, an aquatic plant that could be carbon dated to determine the age of the tracks. The authors of the study admit that the dates raise questions about when and how, supposedly from Siberia, humans settled in the region, but maintain it is further evidence that they skirted the Pacific coast while inland routes were entrenched in ice. As you can see, even with the unequivocal white sands evidence pushing back human inhabitation in North America to over 20,000 years ago, academia still clings to a modified Berengian model that has simply added water voyages down the Pacific coast from Alaska. They seem intent on categorically discounting any departure routes not originating in Northeast Asia. 6 years before the White Sands study back in 2015, the archaeological site at Monte Verde in southern Chile was redated to around 16,500 BC. Charcoal remains, charred animal bone fragments, and several lithic artifacts, about 35% of which were derived from non-local sources, were discovered. Even in the face of having to rewrite their dates, academia argued that since Monte Verde is located 8,000 miles south of the Bering Strait, the distance was probably unreasonable to trek by foot, especially on ice. Furthermore, remains of 22 varieties of seaweed are referenced regarding this theory. Modern native inhabitants of the regions use these local seaweed varieties for medicinal purposes. Researchers posit that the Monte Verde residents use these varieties for similar purposes, which further suggests an extensive knowledge of marine resources. Together with a relative lack of stone tools, it appears that these first settlers were maritime adapted hunter-gatherer fishermen, and not necessarily big-game hunters like the Clovis. Therefore, they argue it is feasible that they traveled along the coast by boat or along the shoreline and could survive on marine resources throughout the voyage south. Of course, many of our viewers are likely asking themselves the same thing we have asked here at the archive. Why are these maritime adapted hunter-gatherer fishermen necessarily from Northeast Asia? Well, not all the history regarding the Americas is found at the end of a microscope. And even though academia at large remains intractable regarding its singular Northeast Asia origin theory, many other hypotheses exist, and some of them are directly related to ancient astronauts. As researcher and scholar Zachariah Sitchin explained, quote, "Scholars have a problem with a crossing of the oceans by boats 15,000 or 20,000 years ago. Man, they hold, was too primitive then to have ocean-going vessels and navigate the high seas. Not until the Sumerian civilization at the beginning of the 4th millennium BC did mankind begin to attain the land and water means of long-range transportation. But, according to the Sumerians themselves, that was the course of events after the deluge. There had been, they stated and restated, a high civilization upon earth before the deluge. A civilization begun on earth by those who had come from the planet of Anu, and continued through a line of long-living demigods. Egyptian chronicles, such as the writings of the priest Manetho, followed the same concept, and so did the Bible, which describes both rural and urban civilization before the deluge. All that, however, according to all those ancient sources, was wiped off the face of the earth by the deluge, and everything had to be restarted from scratch. Like the biblical Hebrews, who trace back their genealogies not only to patriarchal couples but also to the beginning of mankind, so did the Aztecs and Toltecs and other Nahuatl tribes possess legends of creation that followed the same themes. But whereas the Old Testament compressed its detailed Sumerian sources by devising one plural entity, the Elohim, out of the various deities active in the creative processes, the Nahuatl tales retain the Sumerian and Egyptian concepts of divine beings acting either alone or in concert. Tribal beliefs, prevalent from the southwestern United States in the north to today's Nicaragua in the south, held that at the very beginning there was an olden God, creator of all things, of the heaven and of the earth, whose abode was in the highest heaven, the 12th heaven. This amazingly sounds like a rendering of Mesopotamian celestial religious beliefs, according to which the head of the pantheon was called Anu, meaning Lord of Heaven, and who, with his consort Antu, meaning Lady of Heaven, resided on the outermost planet, the 12th member of our solar system. The Sumerians depicted it as a radiating planet whose symbol was the cross. The symbol was thereafter adopted by all the peoples of the ancient world and evolved to the ubiquitous emblem of the winged disc. Quetzalcoatl's shield and symbols depicted on early Mexican monuments are uncannily similar. The Nahuatl tales spoke of conflict and even warfare among the gods. Such wars for dominion over earth or its resources have been described in the lore of all the ancient peoples. Hittite and Indo-European tales of the wars between Teshub or Indra with their brothers arrived in Greece via Asia Minor. The Semitic Canaanites and Phoenicians wrote down the tales of Baal's wars with his brothers. And in the lands of Ham, Egyptian texts related to the dismemberment of Osiris by his brother Seth and the ensuing bitter and long warfare between Seth and Horus, the son and avenger of Osiris. Were the gods of the Mexicans original conceptions? Or were they memories of beliefs and tales that had their roots in the ancient Near East? The early or prehistoric events affecting mankind and the progenitors of the Nahuatl tribes were divided by legends, pictorial depictions, and stone carvings such as the calendar stone into 4 ages or suns. The Aztec considered their times to have been the most recent of 5 eras, the age of the 5th sun. Each of the previous 4 suns had come to an end through some catastrophe, sometimes a natural one such as the deluge, and sometimes a calamity triggered by wars between the gods. Though versions vary, suggesting a long verbal tradition preceding the written records, they all agree that the first age came to an end by a deluge, a great flood that engulfed the earth. Mankind survived because one couple, Nene and his wife Tata, managed to save themselves in a hollowed-out log. Either the first age or the second one was the age of the white-haired giants. The second sun was recalled as the Golden Age. It was ended by the wind serpent. The third age was presided over by the fire serpent. It was the age of the red-haired people. They were survivors of the second age who had come by ship from the east to the New World, settling in the area called Bodochan. They encountered there giants who also survived the second age and became enslaved by them. The fourth sun was the era of the black-headed people. It was during that era that Quetzalcoatl appeared in Mexico. It was during this era that Tollan, the Toltec capital, was built. Quetzalcoatl, master of wisdom and knowledge, introduced learning, crafts, laws, and time reckoning according to the 52-year cycle. Toward the end of the fourth sun, wars between the gods were taking place. Quetzalcoatl left going east back to the place whence he had come. The gods' wars brought havoc to the land, and Tollan was abandoned. 5 years later, the Chichimeque tribes arrived, and the fifth sun, the Aztec era, began. So, why were the eras called suns, and how long did they last? The reason is unclear, and the length of the various eras is either unstated or differs according to the version. One that appears orderly and astoundingly plausible is the Codex Vaticano-Latino 3738. It relates that the first sun lasted 4,008 years, the second 4,010, the third 4,081. The fourth sun began 5,042 years ago, leaving unstated the time of its ending. Be that as it may, We have here a tale of events going back 17,141 years from the time the tales have been recorded. This is quite a time span for supposedly backward people to recall, and scholars, while agreeing that the events of the fourth sun contain historical elements, tend to dismiss the earlier eras as sheer myth. So, how do we explain the tales of Adam and Eve, a global deluge, the survival of one couple, episodes strikingly reminiscent of the creation narrative in Genesis 2 and of the similar Babylonian cosmogony? Some scholars suggest that Nahuatl texts reflect in some way what the Indians had already heard from the Bible-spouting Spaniards. But since not all codices are post-conquest, the biblical Mesopotamian similarities can only be explained by admitting that the Mexican tribes had some ancestral ties to Mesopotamia. Moreover, the Mexican-Nahuatl timetable correlates events and times with a scientific and historical accuracy that ought to make everyone stop and wonder. It dates the deluge at the end of the first sun to 13,133 years before the time of writing the Codex, which is about 11,600 BC. As we discussed in Part 1, current theories hold that man initially arrived in the New World from Asia across an icy land bridge to Alaska some 20 to 30,000 years ago, spreading gradually southward. But considerable evidence consisting of artifacts, language, and ethnological and anthropological evaluations indicates influences from across the Pacific: Hindu, Southeast Asian, Chinese, Japanese, and Polynesian. Scholars explain them by periodic arrival of such people in the Americas, but they are emphatic in stating that these occurred during the Christian era and not any time BC. While established scholars continue to downplay all evidence for transatlantic contacts between the Old and New World, they employ the concession to relatively recent trans-Pacific contacts as the explanation for the existence of Genesis-like tales in the Americas. Indeed, legends of a global deluge and of creation of man out of clay or similar materials have been themes of mythologies all over the world, and one possible route to the Americas from the Near East could have been Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. But there are elements in the Nahuatl versions that point to a very early source, rather than to relatively recent pre-conquest centuries. One is the fact that the Nahuatl tales of the creation of man follow a very ancient Mesopotamian version that did not even find its way into the book of Genesis. The Bible, in fact, has not one but two versions of the creation of man. Both draw on earlier Mesopotamian versions, but both ignore a third version, and probably the oldest one, in which mankind was fashioned not of clay, but out of the blood of a god. In the Sumerian text on which this version is based, the god Ea, collaborating with the goddess Ninti, prepared a purifying bath. "Let one god bleed into it," he ordered, "from his flesh and blood. Let Ninti mix the clay." From this mixture men and women were created. It is truly amazing to find all these elements in the Nahuatl tales. A god of knowledge known as the plumed serpent, a goddess of magical powers called Serpent Woman, a bathtub of loam in which earthly elements are mixed with a god's essence, his blood, and the fashioning of man, male and female, out of the mixture. Even more astounding is the fact that the myth has been pictorially depicted in a Nahuatl codex found in the area of the Mixtec tribe. It shows a god and a goddess mixing an element that flows into a huge flask or vat with the blood of a god that drips into the flask. Out of the mixture, a man emerges. The Aztecs called their capital Tenochtitlan, the city of Tenoch, so naming it after their ancestor. Considering that in their dialect the Aztecs had prefixed many words with the sound T, Tenoch could have originally been Enoch, if the prefix T is dropped. A Babylonian text based on the earlier Sumerian text from the 3rd millennium BC enigmatically relates to a conflict ending in murder between an earth-tilling and a shepherding brother, just as the biblical Cain and Abel were. Doomed to roam in sorrow, the offending leader, called Cain, migrated to the land of Duno, and there he built a city with twin towers. Twin towers atop the temple pyramids were a hallmark of Aztec architecture. Did this commemorate the building of a city with twin towers by Cain? And was Tenochtitlan, the city of Tenoch, so named and built because Cain, millennia earlier, built a city and called the city by his son's name, Enoch? Have we found in Mesoamerica the lost realm of Cain, the city named after Enoch? The possibility certainly offers plausible answers to the enigma of man's beginning in these domains. Legends of prehistoric arrival by sea and landings on the Pacific coast are not confined to the Mexican peoples. Farther south, the Andean peoples retained memories of a similar nature, told as legends. One, the legend of Namelap, may relate to the very first settlement on those coasts by people from elsewhere. It tells of the arrival of a great fleet of balsa reed boats. A green stone that could utter the words of the people's god, placed in the lead boat, directed the immigrants' leader, Namelap, to the chosen beach. The deity speaking through the green idol then instructed the people in the arts of farming, building, and handicrafts. Some versions of the legend of the green idol pinpointed Cape Santa Helena in Ecuador as the landing site. There, the South American continent projects westward into the Pacific. Several of the Spanish chroniclers related native traditions that the first settlers in the equatorial regions were giants. The human settlers who followed there worshipped a pantheon of 12 gods, headed by the sun and the moon. Is it possible that people from distant lands had crossed the Pacific and come to the Andes in prehistoric times? The link that evidently existed is confirmed by depictions illustrating the feats of an ancient Near Eastern hero whose tales were told and retold. He was Gilgamesh, ruler of Uruk, who had reigned circa 2900 BC. He went in search of the hero of the deluge story, whom the gods had granted immortality. His adventures were told in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was translated in the antiquity from Sumerian into the other languages of the Near East. One of his heroic deeds, the wrestling with and defeat of 2 lions with his bare hands, was a favorite pictorial depiction by ancient artists, as this one on a Hittite monument. Amazingly, the same depiction appears on stone tablets from the northern Andes. These Indo-Europeans have not been traced in Mesoamerica or Central America, and we must assume that they came across the Pacific straight to South America. If legends be the guide, they preceded the 2 waves of African giants and Mediterranean bearded ones and could have been the earliest settlers of which the tale of Namelap recounts. Every version of every legend in the Andes points to Lake Titicaca for the beginning, the place where the great god Viracocha performed his creative feats, where mankind reappeared after the deluge, and where the ancestors of the Incas were granted a golden wand with which to establish Andean civilization. Indeed, it is on the shores of Lake Titicaca that the first and greatest city in all of the Americas had stood, Tiahuanacu. The greatest explorer of Tiahuanacu and its ruins was, without doubt, Arthur Poznański, a European engineer who moved to Bolivia at the turn of the 20th century and devoted his lifetime to unraveling the mysteries of these ruins. Poznański quickly concluded that these were remains of a civilization that disappeared before that of the Incas began, a civilization contemporary with that of Egypt and the Near East. The remains indicate that the structures and the monuments were the work of people who were capable of a unique, perfect, and harmonious architecture, yet one that had no infancy and passed through no period of growth. No wonder, then, that the locals had told the Spaniards centuries earlier that these artifacts were raised overnight by giants. Poznański's most astounding and controversial conclusion was that Tiahuanacu's first phase was built when the level of the lake was about 100 feet higher and before the whole area had been engulfed by an avalanche of water, perhaps the Great Flood, thousands of years before the Christian era. They made measurements and observations at Tiahuanacu between November 1926 and June 1928. The astronomical team concluded that the results could indeed indicate a date circa 15,000 BC, but also one of 9300 BC, depending on the curve used. Needless to say, even the latter date was simply unacceptable to the scientific community, and that remains the case even to this day. For regular viewers, you may remember that we addressed the idea of ancient astronauts in Mesoamerica in a previous video. In that production, we presented a detailed timeline of the Anunnaki migration from the Middle East into the Americas. Here is an abbreviated version of that timeline. In 15,608 BC, we have the beginning of the age of the first sun, known as the age of white-haired giants or the age of Viracochas. According to the Codex Vaticano-Latino 3738, the first sun lasted 4,008 years. Circa 15,000 BC, the Colossaea, a rectangular enclosure measuring some 450 by 400 feet, was constructed. Circa 11,600 BC, the deluge occurred, marking the end of the age of the first sun and the beginning of the age of the second sun, known as the Golden Age by the Aztecs, or the Age of Giants by the Inca. The age lasted 410 years and ended with a calamity involving the wind serpent. The deluge flooded the gold mines in Africa but exposed a motherlode of gold in the Andes Mountains of South America, enabling the Anunnaki to obtain more gold more easily and quickly, and without the need for smelting and refining. It also made it possible to reduce the number of Anunnaki needed on Earth. In 7,590 BC, we have the beginning of the age of the third sun, the age of the red-haired people. The third sun lasted 4,081 years and ended possibly due to quakes and storms. Circa 4,000 BC, on their state visit to Earth, Anu and Antu visited the post-diluvial procurement base on the shores of Lake Titicaca. The visit served as an opportunity to begin reducing the number of Nibiruans on Earth. It also approved peace arrangements between the rival half-brothers and their warring clans. But while Enki and Enlil accepted the territorial divisions, Enki's son Marduk never gave up the strife for supremacy that included control of the olden space-related sites in the Middle East. It was then that the Enlilites began to prepare alternative spaceport facilities in South America. In 3,509 BC, we have the beginning of the age of the fourth sun, the age of the black-headed people according to the Aztecs, or the age of heroes according to the Inca. This is the era in which Quetzalcoatl appeared in Mexico. Toward the end of the fourth sun, wars between the gods were taking place. The fourth sun had begun 5,042 years before the time of the Codex Vaticano-Latino 3738, which was written in 1533 AD. The time the fourth sun ended is not stated, but the codex was written during the fifth sun. The fifth sun is referred to as the Age of Kings by the Incas. Circa 3450 BC, the incident of the Tower of Babel took place, which was the attempt by Marduk to obtain primacy for his city Babylon in Mesopotamia. Frustrated in his effort to assume supremacy in civilized Sumer, Marduk seized upon the granting of civilization to the Egyptians to return to that land and reclaim its lordship from his brother Thoth. In 3113 BC, after Marduk's reclamation of Egypt, Thoth, accompanied by some of his faithful followers, chose an abode in the New Realms, in Mesoamerica. August 13th, 3113 BC, is the enigmatic day 1 of the Mayan calendar's long count. The long count, like 2 other calendars used by the Maya, was based on a vigesimal mathematical system. This is like Sumerian counting, with a 1 in a first column being 1, 20 in the next column, and 400 in the third. Many researchers believe that this date marks the arrival of the African Olmecs in Mesoamerica. In 2024 BC, the evil wind is unleashed in Samaria, as Sodom and Gomorrah are atom-bombed, and the winds carry radioactive carnage to Ur of the Chaldees. The Sumerian civilization ceases to exist. When the post-diluvial spaceport in the Sinai was wiped out, the facilities in South America were the only ones left entirely in Enlilite hands. When the Anunnaki leadership decided that it was time to leave Earth, some decided to use the landing place in Baalbek. Others, perhaps with a last large haul of gold, had to use the South American facilities near the place where Anu and Antu stayed during their visit to the area. These arrival tales are not only vastly different from the modern Beringia model, but they also hint at the fact that numerous immigrations were inspired by different members of the Anunnaki. This, of course, did not bode well for peace being a natural offshoot in the Americas. Another fundamental contradiction of the modern Beringia model is the fact that the oldest structures discovered thus far are in Meso and South America. As mentioned earlier, Monteverde is an archaeological site in southern Chile, which has been dated to as early as 16,500 BC. Sechin Bajo is a large archaeological site located in the valley of the Sechin River, about 7.5 miles from the Pacific Ocean, and has ruins dating from 3,500 BC. The sacred city of Corral Supe is attributed to an antiquity of 5,000 years. Just these 3 examples demonstrate constructions that are many thousands of years older than those found in North America. So, what about North America? Well, North America is where the academics say everything happened first, right? As we have already pointed out, they are intent on convincing us that there was only one migration route to the Western Hemisphere via Northeast Asia. While we do not find any structures in North America that can match the age of a place like Monteverde, there are other potential remnants of the Anunnaki found within the oral traditions of the North American indigenous people. Our regular viewers are likely aware that the Anunnaki were literal giants, averaging approximately 10 feet tall. Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, Sacsayhuaman, Tiahuanacu, Teotihuacan, as well as many other locations in South America are connected with giants. A few examples of giants appearing in North American history include the Choctaw, who say that after their people crossed the Mississippi River, they met a powerful race of cannibal giants who came from the east. The Sioux say that the earth was originally peopled by giants, who were 3 times the size of modern man. They too say the giants were wiped out by a great flood. Navajo legends tell of great giants that used to wander the land. They believe that some giants used to live in the Grand Canyon, and they were 10 to 18 feet tall. In fact, several North American tribes have passed down legends of a race of giants who were wiped out. Here is a brief list for you to investigate. Beyond the oral traditions of the Native Americans, in North America there is also a litany of archaeological findings and news reports related to giants. Back in 2019, the Archive released a 3-part series on the history of giants. In Part 3, we focus on the Western Hemisphere in detail. A link to that presentation has been provided in the description. Numerous Native American legends tell stories of extraterrestrial visits from star people or sky gods. Both the Orion constellation and Pleiades star cluster are referenced with some regularity among ancient native peoples. The Hopi believe their ancestors came from the Pleiades. It is the place or people they call Chuhukan. Likewise, early Dakota legends speak of the Pleiades as the abode of their ancestors. Other Native American tribes with legends of extraterrestrials include the Cree, the Lakota, and the Sunni. The Sunni Indians offer one of many belief systems, if not actual experiences, related to ancestors who came from the sky. Clifford Mahudi, a Sunni leader and member of the Kachina Society, tells us that his grandfathers taught him about a very direct connection his people have had with beings from space. Mahudi explains, quote, "My tribe is the Sunni tribe. We believe that we were connected to the extraterrestrials from the beginning of what we call the beginning of the fourth world. The extraterrestrials are the ones that are related to us, not only in where they came from, but we also are aware that they gave us a connection to the different systems, like the star systems, and they actually are our teachers." Mahudi continues, quote, "They're actually our ancestors because we took their DNA, and when they upgraded us, American Indians believed that we were all connected with the star people as our distant relatives. Although we were on the planet, we took their teachings and they upgraded us through their efforts. So in the long run, we're part alien." End quote. In his book Black Elk, The Sacred Ways of the Lakota, Wallace Black Elk tells the story of seeing a UFO come down from the sky and telepathic communication with its occupants. In no uncertain terms, one of the most prominent Sioux Indians of all time, a historic figure, a cousin of Crazy Horse, tells us that he met ETs who arrived in a luminous disk. Circling back to the Hopi, we can observe that there seems to be an undeniable connection between the Hopi and the Orion constellation. The natural structure of the 3 Hopi mesas mirrors the 3 stars in the belt of Orion, and it is said that is why the Hopi chose to settle in this location. They believe this place to be the center of their universe, where they can contact the gods. Furthermore, when connected to other Hopi monuments and landmarks around the southwest, the collective sites are said to map the entire constellation of Orion. For more detailed information regarding star constellations and Native American beliefs about extraterrestrials, the Archive has produced 2 videos, Orion's Belt in Egyptian, Mayan, and Hopi Cultures, and The Ancient Hopi and Star People. Links to both videos are included in the description. So, what about these ancient astronauts in America? It seems that a ton of Mesoamerican and South American history easily refutes the dogmatic academic effort to make us believe there was only one migration route to the Western Hemisphere through Northeast Asia. Indeed, academia wants us to believe that somehow all the people in the Western Hemisphere, circa 18,000 BC and after, were descendants of a singular migration occurring from easternmost Asia, primarily over a land bridge or skirting a coast. Yet, discoveries by members of their own ilk have turned up structures in South America which represent entire civilizations that come close to matching the age of the earliest bones they have found in caves in North America. When the history you think you know is so blatantly wrong with these actual current events proving it so, how do you readjust your brain? Do you ignore the facts and engage in your cognitive dissonance? Or do you realize the history you have been taught is suspect at the very least? And maybe there is much more to learn.